that brings us then to Japan. What's really fascinating about Japan is there was a sense where economic success became the meaning of what it was to be Japanese. Right? So the Japanese are going to develop a kind of culture of pride by the 1980s, where they say, look, Japan is awesome. Look at how we have developed. And that's because we're just awesome. It's just part of our culture. Our culture emphasizes harmony and hard work. Other people are divided and, let's face it, lazy. I mean, that, and I'm not saying that's how things are, but that's what this Japanese argument was, right? We Japanese can take pride in what we have achieved because of our harmony and our hard work. That's just a part of our cultural DNA. But these other people who are not so well advanced, well, they're just kind of lazy. Now, this ignores the outside assistance that Japan received, the aid it received. It also ignores the fact that much of this success was made possible by a favorable economic climate in which you had this kind of global capitalism so Japan could export, and where the United States was willing to sacrifice its economic interests for political interests. In other words, we were willing to allow Japan to ship its products to the United States while it engaged in protectionism at home because we wanted to build up our Cold War ally. Right? We wanted to build up our Cold War ally. And this actually led to some conflict between the Japan and the United States in the 1980s because, of course, they were doing so well, and the United States had some hiccups in the 1980s. And it's actually what I think is fascinating to me as someone who became interested in East Asia. This is where a lot of my interest came from because I was in high school in the early and mid 1990s. And that's when some of this was still around, this idea, the Japanese, they're doing well economically, and it's because they cheat. Right, that was kind of the message we were given, even at school, right? And so, to be fair, even though Japanese would pat themselves on the back and say, "Aren't we awesome?" while ignoring assistance they received from the outside, in the United States, we were kind of doing the same thing in reverse. We were saying, "Oh, why aren't we doing as well as Japan?" Well, it's because the Japanese cheat, right? The Japanese cheat, and I remember. In class in high school watching these kind of documentaries that the teachers would show us, and there was this kind of presentation as the Japanese as this kind of robotic people, right? They were presented to us in school uniforms and kind of in their factory uniforms. They all, in my high school, it was like 99% white. We couldn't really tell Asian people apart. And so we looked at them as kind of robots and we were frightened of them. And then I went to college. I met lots of people from China, Japan, and Korea. And I realized, we had been misled in a sense, right? We had been told, well, these people, they're kind of bad, they're cheating, they're not playing fair, and they're scary. And I learned that, this view was not 100% true, right? So, and a lot of my interest in East Asia came from trying to understand and overcome these problematic ideas I had been taught and trying to understand this culture, this civilization, these cultures that I found increasingly interesting. And this is just a human tendency, right? When we have problems, we blame other people. When things go well for us, we just take all the credit ourselves. Now, I should point out that one problem that Japan is going to have in the 1990s, though, is they're going to suffer a real estate bust that will basically torpedo their whole economy. So throughout the 1990s and into 2000s, they will experience what was first called the lost decade and then what became the lost decades, in that Japan didn't enjoy really much of any economic growth during that time period, right? So the 1980s are kind of the high point of Japanese economic growth, but that's really going to go downhill in the 1990s into the 2000s. It's being turned around at the time of this lecture I'm giving, and hopefully it will continue. Economic growth, it would be a good thing. So there's this kind of question, what should Japan be? Right? It's problematic to find meaning in the economy. I mean, to a certain extent, it's kind of hollow. I mean, once you get to a certain level of economic development, what else do you want? And what's the point of working all the time? I mean, you can, I guess if you work, you can get a bigger TV. But at a certain point, who cares how big your TV is? Especially if you don't have time to watch it because you're working all the time. Right? There's a problem of trying to find meaning in the economy, and this just becomes bigger once your economy is not doing so well. I mean, you can find meaning in the economy in the 1980s, but when you're stuck in a recession or zero growth, like in the 1990s and into the 2000s, where do you find meaning? Now, that's not to say that the economy is not important, but when you think about Japan's economy, it raises a serious issue. So Japan, at the time of recording this lecture, and I imagine it will continue, is the third largest economy in the world, right? Only China and the United States have a bigger economy than Japan, right? So Japan has the third largest economy. And yet, when you think about it, if you were to open a newspaper, what countries do you read about in terms of America's foreign relations? Well, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Britain. Countries that, with the exception of China, have smaller economies than Japan. So in a sense, from the Japanese perspective, we have all this economic power. Shouldn't we do something with it other than just get rich? Right? We have all this economic power. Shouldn't we do something with it other than get rich? Right? I remember, just to give you kind of a sense of how this works, when I was in Japan once, I had a taxi driver and I was chatting with him in Japanese, but turned out he spoke English and his English was much better than my Japanese. So we switched to English and he explained to me that he was retired, but he drove a cab to make money, and he would drive a cab for several months, take the money that he earned and go to Africa and help out with development projects. Right. So he was a Japanese person who, as part of the third largest economy in the world, was trying to do something meaningful with that money. And he wanted to go out and do something. Right. And he was able to do it because they were so wealthy. Well, there's a lot of Japanese people who want to do that nationwide. Now, there's different ways that people want to do that. In his case, he wanted to engage in developmental help. Right. He wanted to go help dig wells so people could have clean drinking water and things like that. But there's also another aspect. Here's the thing. Japan benefits from world trade and from global security that makes that world trade possible, but it's limited in its ability to help maintain it. For example, other countries will send troops to help in various places where there's a civil war or where there's a natural disaster or something like that, right? UN peacekeeping forces, for example. Japan cannot do that because of the Article 9 of its constitution, right? It's very complex, and the Japanese are some Japanese are trying to figure out a way around this. So Japan benefits from world security, it benefits from world trade, but it's limited in its ability to actually do anything to help maintain it. And especially during the first Gulf War in 1991, Japan was heavily criticized because it just basically wrote a check to help deal with this kind of security problem caused by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. But the problem, of course, is Article 9 of the Constitution. So some Japanese, particularly on the right, the conservatives, want constitutional reform to get rid of Article 9, or at least change it, so that Japan can develop its military and deploy it abroad legally. There, however, is opposition from the Japanese left and internationally over this. And this points to Japan's problem of history, right? This points to Japan's problem of history. So many Japanese people say, hey, we're a big economy. We need to find meaning for what it means to be Japanese. We need to do that on an international on international scale, right? As a country, not simply as individuals. Some want to do it like the taxi driver I mentioned, like engaging in things like development. Others, though, want to be, in a sense, more like a country like Russia, which has military power and uses its military power to exert influence. What prevents that is this problem of history. Now, what do I mean by this problem of history? Well, Japan colonized its neighbor of Korea. And again, I struggled with a way to explain what happened with the comfort women, but basically, this was forcing women against their will to have sex with men. So it was a kind of serial rape, I guess is how you would describe it. I don't know, but it was really terrible, however you want to describe it. And of course, Koreans are going to be a little bit nervous if Japan starts talking about increasing its power, especially if it comes to military power. And similarly, China, especially with patriotic education, which tends to emphasize how we were weak and the Japanese came in and beat up on us because we were weak. They're not too fond of the idea of Japan developing its army, developing its military capabilities either. And especially if Japan wants to develop its regional power, that would imply that China's regional power would decline. Right? So there's going to be, so it's very complex, right? And that's one thing we're trying to do in this class is talk about how these countries interact with each other and the history problem. Right? The history problem in Japan of what happened in World War II really limits Japan's ability to develop, especially develop, meaning to develop as a regional world power, even though it's the third largest economy in the world. And when you think about it, it's really fascinating in a certain sense how so much of Japan's domestic policies are connected to what happened in World War II and how that itself is connected to its international situation. Right? Think about that. American politics are not defined by what we did in World War II. Right? If you talk about the political left in the United States, if you talk about the political right of the United States, you don't really need to make any reference to World War II. Maybe you'll make some reference to the New Deal or something like that, but that's not really a division like it is in Japan. And I would argue that both the left and the right in Japan, thinking broadly, are in a sense driven by a certain myth about the war. And I don't say myth in the sense that it's completely false, like a made-up story, but it's kind of a story that is partly true, but also problematic. So the myth on the political left in Japan is that the people were tricked and manipulated into fighting World War II and are therefore innocent. The military on the right were essentially responsible for everything. Therefore, we can trust the people, this is defined in leftist terms, so this would basically mean like workers, to be in charge now. Right, so this tends to focus more on the people, meaning workers, tends to be more stronger in the cities, among intellectuals, among people on the left, of course. Right. Now the problem with this, and I tend to be more, sympathetic with this view in a sense because it tends to encourage more democratic ideals. This ignores the real public support for the war. Japanese people, as we've talked about before, supported the militarists. They supported the war while they were winning. Right? While they were winning. Now, this myth, though, in a sense, justifies the current political order in which the military is weak and the emperor has little power. Right? They're the ones, essentially, this misunderstanding of the emperor, the military having too much power. That's what led to these problems. And they're, like I said, it's not completely false. They're correct. And it justifies this current political order, right, where the military is weak, the emperor has little power. My problem with it is it ignores the fact that many Japanese people were very supportive of the regime and supportive of the destruction of democracy. Now, while the myth on the left, I think, does have a lot of historical truth to it, the myth on the right I find to be particularly problematic, right? The myth on the right argues that the war was fought against Western imperialism for Japanese independence and the liberation of Asia, right? That Japan was a victim of a great power conspiracy where other countries, most notably America, Britain, and the Netherlands, and to a certain extent China, which is kind of odd, but remember the ABCD encirclement, we conspired against Japan to keep them weak. And therefore, Japanese people should look back at World War II with pride, right? They had fought back strongly against this imperialism to liberate Asia. Now, I think there are some problematic interpretations of this and ignoring of important facts. So, for example, as we talked about previously in this class, Filipinos did not see this as liberation because they were going to get their own independent country anyway. Indonesians were quite happy initially for the Japanese to come, but then the Japanese basically treated them like another country that was being colonized. And of course, it's harder to argue that you are liberating Asia when you have colonized Korea. Right. So this takes a lot of distortion. There's a lot of problems with this view. And there's also a tendency to focus in this view, though the left does this too to a certain extent, to focus on their own suffering. So, for example, there's a movie called Grave of the Fireflies. And if you watch this movie, it's all about how these two little kids pictured here suffer in World War II. And it's a really well-made movie. It's very moving. And I don't really have a problem with the movie in and of itself. I have a problem, though, with the fact that the suffering that the Japanese Empire inflicted is not much talked about in movies and things like that. On the other hand, the suffering that Japanese people endured is talked a lot about. And it's important to note a couple things is that they wouldn't have endured that suffering if they didn't first inflict suffering on other people, right? If Japan had not invaded China, the United States would not have bombed Japan. And it's hard to complain too much about the bombing that the Americans committed against Japan when Japan first bombed China and killed a lot of civilians there, right? So one thing I want to stress, I think bombing Chinese civilians, bombing Japanese civilians, both were wrong. But I am consistent. It's inconsistent to argue to ignore Japanese bombing of China while complaining about American bombing of Japan. But the problem is it focuses on their own suffering. What I think is fascinating is that the director of this movie actually came out and said, yes, this movie is meant to understand and respect our ancestors for the suffering they underwent during this war. And it's like, well, I understand that. I think that's important, but the war could have been prevented if the militarists would have been prevented from rising. Though, to be fair, the war could have also been prevented if the United States and Britain would have followed different policies towards Japan. Though the key thing, though, for the myth on the right is it justifies the revision of the Constitution to give the emperor greater importance and to allow a formal army. So one thing I think is, again, fascinating about Japan is how you had this left-right division, which is closely connected to what happened in Asia during World War II. Now, where this tends to really become international in terms of like China or Korea protesting is when it comes to the Yasukuni Shrine. And sometimes what will happen is a Japanese prime minister will visit the shrine, and that's really a big deal. Now, what is Yasukuni Shrine? Well, it was a shrine established by the Meiji Emperor in order to enshrine the war dead who had fought on behalf of the empire. It was state-supported, but now it is independent, right? And that's one thing that makes it very complex because as an independent religious organization, it enjoys religious freedom. So it's not like the government could come in, even if it wanted to, and stop it from operating or tell it what to do. So that's the shrine where inside are enshrined the spirits of many Japanese war dead who died defending the empire. There are also Class A war criminals enshrined there, right, including people executed by the United States following the defeat of Japan. There are Chinese and Koreans who were part of the Japanese Imperial Army. Some of them were forced to be part of the army, and they are enshrined there as well. And because this is therefore so closely connected to World War II, especially, for example, the kamikaze would talk about meeting again at Yasukuni before they took their flights, meaning, we're going to die and then our spirits will meet in Yasukuni. So this is closely connected to World War II. Now, you don't actually go visit the shrine, that building back there. That's in the back. That's kind of private. Where people would actually visit is this part. This is the main hall. And there's room where you can come up and bow if you wanted to. I visited the Yasukuni grounds multiple times. I have never bowed there. I won't bow there. But you can go there and see this area if you'd like. And you'll notice that the connection with the emperor is the chrysanthemum logo, right? That's the symbol of the Japanese imperial house. One thing, though, that is interesting about this shrine and what we have to understand that makes this such a complex place is, while on one side, especially if you're from China or Korea or the United States, this is a place where Class A war criminals are enshrined and given respect. On the other side, this is a shrine for all Japanese war dead. So once when I visited, there was a woman who came along with me whose father had not died in the war, but had suffered in World War II. He'd been captured by the Soviet forces and been thrown in prison for several years before finally being released and able to return to Japan. So for many Japanese people, this is just a place to come pay their respects to their ancestors, to their parents, maybe a father who died, and so forth. Also, because it's Japan and because Shinto tends to focus a lot on nature, there are also monuments built to commemorate the horses, carrier pigeons, and dogs who died in war. And sometimes when I visited the shrine, you can see where someone put out a water bottle in front of one of these statues, and that's meant as an offering to the spirits of these animals who gave their life in the preservation of the empire. So kind of interesting aspect. And you can also get a sense of why families might be interested in this place through this statue. This is a statue commemorating the war widows and orphans of the soldiers who died, to remember them and their sacrifice, right? So, it's not just in a sense the soldier who sacrificed for the nation by giving his life. This woman has given up her husband, her children have given up their father for the empire, right? For its defense. And so this is something that's very meaningful to many Japanese people. But here's kind of the problematic issue, right? Here is something I took from the Yasukuni English version of its website. It says, currently there are more than 2,466,000 divinities enshrined here at Yasukuni Shrine. These are souls of men who made the ultimate sacrifice for the nation since 1853. These people, regardless of their rank or social standing, are considered to be completely equal and worshipped as venerable divinities of Yasukuni. And the problem is this includes, like I said, convicted war criminals, includes colonial subjects. And what's particularly problematic is in 1985, attached to the shrine, there's a museum, which I visited a couple times, and I'm always just astounded whenever I visit there by the historical narrative that they put forth. This is completely revisionist history that basically propagates that myth on the right, which presents itself as, Japan, we were fighting to liberate Asia, and, those nasty Western imperialists, they were just trying to keep us Asians down. And as I said before, this is kind of problematic since, the Filipinos resisted Japanese forces, and of course they had colonized Korea. So it's a highly problematic and controversial museum. Now, connected to all this then are also island disputes, right? So for example, there are multiple islands in East Asia, which there are disputes about who actually owns or controls them. So for example, you can see there near Taiwan, there is what's called in Japanese Senkaku Islands in the People's Republic of China, the Diaoyu Islands in the Republic of China, Taiwan, the Taoyu Tai Islands. And it's the same islands. You can see them on the right. They're very small. That's the islands, right? They're very small. Now, one reason you want to control these islands strategically is that it allows you to claim the ocean around them. And that's kind of a big deal. If at the bottom of the ocean, there's like rare minerals or oil or something like that. So that's why people want the islands in part. But this also is connected to military interests and to this history. So you'll notice, you may recall, we talked about how Japan expanded its empire and from Japan to the Ryukyu Islands to Taiwan, and then finally invaded China. And so, if you're Chinese, you're very upset because that Japan has these islands, both because you think that they're yours, right? Japan currently controls these islands. The Chinese say these are our islands. But also, if you're Chinese, this seems like Japan trying to push closer to China again. It didn't work out so well when that happened last time. And by golly, we need a strong China to stand up so the Japanese don't invade us again, right? So in a sense, the island disputes, I think, would be something that would be relatively easy to work out through compromise in some important ways, but neither side wants to give because it becomes an issue of national pride, and this is further magnified by what happened during World War II. There is a similar issue with Korea. There's an island called Tokto, which the Koreans claim and which they control. The Japanese government, though, says it actually belongs to Japan. Right, so that's another dispute where you have this island. There's argument about who owns it. Like I said, the Koreans are currently in control. But the thing is, this is made even more kind of divisive and even more difficult to have any kind of compromise over because of that colonial legacy. Right, the Japanese took over our country. They're trying to do it again. And one thing that I think is really striking about this image is something I found just by Googling, and you can see it's got the island of Dokdo, or the islands that make up Dokdo there, and it has superimposed the Comfort Woman statue, right? So it directly connects what happened to Japan, or what Japan did to Korea when Korea was its colony, to this current issue of who is the rightful owner of this island. Right, so what could be something that's strategically or economically something you could compromise on, you can't do it because of this close connection to national pride, to the suffering that came out of the colonial period, and so forth. And in a sense, if there was to be a war in Asia again, which I hope will not happen, it might come about over some dispute over these islands. Because it's very difficult for either side to back down. This is so closely connected to national pride that neither side wants to give up its claims, and it's almost impossible to compromise. Right? So this is a point where you could actually have some kind of war. Now, I don't want to just focus on such depressing issues. One thing I should point out, even though in a sense Japan doesn't wield hard power in the same way, say, Russia does because of its great military, Japan also has a huge amount of soft power that Japan has through manga, through anime, through a lot of popular culture, through its coolness factor, has a huge influence on the outside world. And whatever you want to say about manga or anime, some people are really big fans, some people despise manga and anime, whatever you want to say about it, I would say overall this is a pretty positive influence on the world. People like being influenced by this in a way they don't like being influenced by tanks and machine guns, right? So this is something that I think Japanese people can be proud of, right, in terms of how they influence the world, right? Now, you might ask, why did you pick these images to represent manga and anime? A lot of you, even anime fans, may not recognize them. It's Azumanga Daioh on the left and Yotsuba on the right. And of course, the reason I chose them is because my 12-year-old son, who likes anime and manga, said these are the ones that I should show. So that's why you've got these. By the way, Azumanga Daioh is hilarious. That's got a little girl in a penguin suit. The cat that is on her head, usually there's another cat connected to it. And those two cats are called Neko Koneko. In Japanese, Neko means cat. And so you have two cats connected. So it's Neko Koneko. Neko cat connected to Neko cat. The Japanese are brilliant at puns, right? And on the right, Yotsuba is the crazy adventures of this little green-haired girl and her friends and family, and it's really awesome too. Highly recommend it. Good stuff for kids. And of course, as I did with China, I want to end with some pictures of Japanese people who are friends of mine. On the right is my friend Atsuko. She was studying a master's degree while I was working on a PhD in Vancouver, University of British Columbia. And the thing is, I got my PhD in Canada, in Vancouver, Canada. And I got along really well with Canadian people, and I'm always thankful for the Canadians for their generosity. My PhD was very cheap to get. I didn't have to spend a lot of money on it because the government was so generous, and the Canadians were great. There was a group of Canadian students that would always try and mess with me because they knew I was from the United States, that they would always be like American bashing. And I mean, sometimes it just got ludicrous. Like there was a guy who claimed that the Americans never landed a man on the moon. I'm like, okay, this is just silly. But basically he just didn't like the Americans, and anything he could take away from us, he took away from us. And Atsuko, before she came to work on her master's degree, had worked with the United States Navy and Japan. And she had a really good time with American people. And so even though she didn't always agree with the American government, she just did not like anti-Americanism at all. And she would always stick up for the United States. And I always thought that was cool. On the left is another friend of ours from Vancouver, Canada. That's Akiko Kinoshita. She is a wonderful person, very generous person. And she's always interesting to me because she speaks English very well. Of course, her Japanese is fluent, and she also speaks fluent Chinese. Her Mandarin is fluent. She has done a lot of research on China and spent a lot of time in China. She can even speak some Shanghaiese. And she's currently editor of a major women's magazine in Japan, focusing on the needs of business women. And when I went to visit Japan the last time, it was funny. I asked her if there was anything she wanted, and she said, please bring English books for my daughter. So I loaded my luggage with English books, and there she is with her very, very, very cute daughter reading the English book. And there on the right, you can see me. I'm basically in heaven. I mean, that little child was extraordinarily cute, and was the friendliest child I'd ever met. I mean, sometimes kids are kind of scared of you, but this kid just wanted to hug me and play with me, and we had a great time. And there she is, and she was especially happy because she's a fan of Anpanman. And you can maybe see if you look between her feet, there's like a little stuffed animal. That's Bean Bread Man, Anpanman in Japanese. He's a superhero made of bread. And he's hilarious because like sometimes when he's fighting, his head will get soggy. Like his enemies will dump water on his head, and they have to get him, I kid you not, a replacement head. They'll actually take off his head, and it's all soggy, and give him a new head, and then he'll defeat his enemies. But she loved Anpanman. And so one day she was sick, so I went out to Akihabara, which is like the anime district, and bought her an Anpanman doll, and she really appreciated that. And so there she's sitting on me. Very cute, very friendly daughter. And again, I just want us to understand by showing these pictures, you know, the people we're talking about. They're people just like you have in the United States, have their own interests, their own desires, own lives, and they're trying to just make a living in this world. Same as all of us.